in the conversation that's about to be played, um, I talked with Philippe Lemoine. I don't actually know if that's how you pronounce his name, probably not. But Philippe is a philosopher and a writer about various things. He writes for the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. He also writes on his own personal Substack called Stream of Randomness, as well as on his personal Twitter. I'll link all of his platforms down below if you want to go check out his work, which I would advise. I've been following Philippe for a little while. In particular, I've been following his commentary on the current situation in Gaza, and that's what I invited him to talk with me about, so that I could, give him an opportunity to give him a platform to kind of talk about his perspective on the current war between Israel and Hamas. If you want to call it a war, perhaps more aptly described as a massacre or something along those lines. Um, so yeah, hopefully everybody enjoys this conversation. So recently on your blog, you've been writing a bit about the current situation in Gaza, starting with the October 7th attacks from Hamas and the, ensuing Israeli counteroffensive and whatnot. And I guess it's that I invited you to talk about because I follow your blog and I've been appreciative largely of what you had to say. I thought that your writing about the subject has been pretty thoughtful, and so I just wanted to discuss some of the relevant issues. So I guess to catch viewers up to speed, in case there's any of whom who've been living under a rock or something. Obviously, on October 7th, Hamas launched a series of rockets at Israel. Meanwhile, its militants breached the Israel-Gaza border and proceeded to carry out attacks on Israeli military bases and civilian centers. Hamas's attack killed, I think it's reported now, about 1,100 something Israelis, mostly civilians. Um, Probably definitely the most successful attack Hamas has ever been able to launch against Israel. And then in response, after clearing out the Hamas forces in southern Israel, the IDF conducted extensive airstrikes in Gaza, in addition to cutting off food, water, and electricity. And then following that, Israel launched a ground invasion of Gaza. So far, I think it's reported that around 19,000 or so Gazans have been killed, overwhelmingly civilians by all counts. In addition, millions have been displaced. There's a humanitarian catastrophe. Lots of people facing threat of starvation, hospitals barely being able to operate because of insufficient resources, etc. Um, and so that's the kind of backdrop of this conversation, I suppose. Um, and so I guess I wanted to start by talking about Israel's counteroffensive to the October 7th attacks. And in your article, Israel's 9/11 moment, you talk a little bit about the mindset of Israel following the October 7th attacks and sort of how that mindset influences the likelihood that the Israeli response to the attacks will be sort of both instrumentally and strategically rational, as well as kind of in line with morality. So maybe you could start a bit, you could start by telling us a little bit about that dynamic. Like what do you think is driving the current Israeli reaction, and what are the dangers posed by the answer to that question?
I think the main thing that's driving it is a form of righteous anger, which is obviously understandable after what happened on October 7. But the argument I'm making, which I don't even think is particularly original, is that when people are driven by righteous anger, they tend to make stupid decisions. And so I make the comparison of 9/11 because I think that's what happened after 9/11. There is an excellent book by Michael Mazar called Leap of Faith, which is about the decision making in the US after 9/11. And he makes this distinction, which is not actually a distinction he came up with. It's a distinction some psychologist whose name I forgot came up with between what he calls the logic. What is it? Oh fuck. Shit, I forgot the expressions he uses. But basically, the idea is that you have two forms of, it's a rough distinction between two forms of decision making. One which is mainly, the policy equivalent of instrumental rationality, where you said you have a certain goal and then you carefully ponder what are the most effective means to achieve this goal. And then there's this other logic which is different from that, where you're mainly driven by some of like normative considerations, and so you're trying to do the right thing, not to do the thing that will maximize the probability that your strategic goals will be achieved, but to do the right thing. And so it shows, that in the case of the US after 9/11, this he argues at any rate, but I think, in my opinion, convincingly, that the fact that they used the second logic was instrumental, no pun intended, in explaining the mistakes that were made after 9/11, because people weren't really thinking about whether their actions were going to be conducive to improving the situation of the US, but really they were thinking in terms of what was, again, to put it briefly, the right thing to do. And so I think that when you inject moralizing into policy making in that way, it very often doesn't end well. And that's not to say, I say inject moralizing, that's not to say that I think that morality has nothing to do with policymaking. I don't think that at all. But I think this is a very superficial way of thinking morally about policy. And if you're at the head of a state, or you have some responsibilities, that some real influence on decision making at the highest level in the government, I think that your moral responsibility is to carefully think about the consequences of your action. That's actually one of the names of the two things, called that the logic of consequences. Hopefully the other name will come back to me, but it doesn't really matter. And so because in not doing so, historically it often backfired. And so I think that right now, again, for understandable reason, after what happened on October 7th, the Israeli are dominated by this kind of logic, where they're thinking, they're animated mainly by righteous anger, which goes together like the desire to get payback. And so I don't think they were thinking, very clearly in their response. And I actually think that since then there's been evidence that, because I wrote that immediately after the thing, that was more of a prediction based on like historical precedents. I do think that now we have evidence that this was true. And the main evidence I see is that there have been various reports in the press about how the Israeli are still hoping that they can get Egypt, for instance, to rule the Gaza after they're done, and they really don't want to administer it themselves, to occupy it indefinitely again. Even more recently, there was another report about how they had told the U.S. officials that they were planning on leaving keeping a temporary presence just in the north of Gaza. But even that would be temporary, and eventually they'd leave, and it's just not clear. I think, this is evidence to me, like they really don't want to occupy Gaza indefinitely again, which I can understand. I was arguing I remember, I was arguing already in the first piece I wrote about this, that yes, this would be bad for them. And that's precisely why I thought they shouldn't go there, because that's the only logical outcome. But I think, this is evidence that they're still hoping that somehow, although clearly they don't have a plan about how they're going to accomplish that, they're going to be able to, invade Gaza, take out Hamas completely, and then somehow prevent Hamas from being resurrected and eventually maybe taking back control of Gaza without having to occupy it again, because for understandable reason they don't want to occupy it again, because that would be very costly and would not uh, improve their well, at least you can disagree about this. I actually have some Israeli friends who disagree about this, but and if the government eventually leaves Gaza, they will be very pissed off for that reason. But I don't think it will improve the strategic prospects of Israel if they have to occupy it again indefinitely. And so, but in any case, they seem to share my assessment, unlike my Israeli friends. I mean, the members of the Israeli government, if those press reports are true, because they seem to think that they can do this, what they're doing right now, without in the end having to occupy indefinitely Gaza. And to me, this is evidence that they didn't think clearly because before they decided to launch this full-scale invasion of Gaza, because I don't think there is any other possible outcome here other than just eventually leaving, which I know is apparently, according to this report again, what they're thinking of doing. Although I think they will be forced to, if that's their plan, I think they will be forced to jettison it, because they will realize that this will just bring them back to square one, and there will be heavy pressure not to do this. But if this report is true, then it suggests that they went in thinking that there would be some kind of Deus ex machina, like Egypt would accept to take over. Which again, there were several reports saying that the Israeli were trying really hard to bribe the Egyptians to so that they would accept to go in, after the war and administer Gaza. But it's just like it's totally unrealistic. It's never going to happen. I mean, the the Egyptian leaders know that if they do this, it doesn't matter how much money the Israeli are promising them. They know that if they do this, there is a high probability they will be killed by someone in the Egyptian population, because it will be seen as a betrayal and collaboration with Israel. That seems unacceptable to enough people that there is a fair chance Sisi would be killed if he did that. So I don't, and also they have no reason to do Israel a favor. I mean, those guys, why would they take a risk of getting killed by a fanatic who sees them as an Israeli collaborator because of that, when just to get, that was apparently the deal that was floated by the Israeli to them, just to get the Egyptian debt canceled. I mean, they have pretty good control over the population. They're pretty secure. There was this revolution more than 10 years ago, but they were able to undo it for the most part after like a year or something. Uh, why would, they're living the good life. Why would they take this chance to do a favor to Israel? It's crazy. It's never going to happen. But apparently, this was the preferred option by the Israeli government. And this is telling me that they didn't think before they did this, because if they thought, if this was their plan, their main option for the post-war situation, that was just, that's not evidence that they were thinking, that they thought really hard about this before. Because this is just a delusional plan. And they also don't want the PA, the Palestinian Authority, to rule in Gaza after this. I actually think that this is also unrealistic. This because, first of all, I seriously doubt that the PA would take the risk, for similar reason as Sisi and the Egyptians, to take over Gaza after the war, because they would be seen as collaborators, and already there's like heavy pressure on them to resume armed opposition to Israel, which may happen eventually. It's hard to know. At least we certainly can't rule it out. And even if they did accept, suppose that they did accept, it's clear that they're already very unpopular. Their popularity would drop so much that they wouldn't have the you know they wouldn't have the pull to do this, to administer Gaza. So the Israeli, in any case, would be forced to leave their army over there to provide muscle for the PA, because the PA would just not be able to do it, and they would just eventually, Hamas would take back control. So yeah, I think everything is pushing. The logical outcome of all this is that Israel is going to have to reoccupy Gaza indefinitely. And according to, again, many different media reports, they just don't want to do this. But if they don't want to do this, why did they do something whose logical outcome is this? Again, this is just evidence that they didn't think clearly. To me, to a large extent, we'll see how this turns out later, but it vindicates the prediction I was making at the time that because they were animated mainly by those emotions of righteous anger, the desire for retribution, and this thinking along the lines of this uh, not the logic of consequence, but the idea that they had to do the right thing, which was to punish the trespassers, the Hamas, who had committed this horrible crime. I think they're they decided to go in because also there was like immense pressure, to be fair, from the Israeli public to deliver this retribution without having a clear plan about the post-war situation. And I think it will be bad. It will be bad also with the US because once they reoccupy it, as I think they will have to do, then it will be under like renewed pressure by the US to uh, make a real attempt at having a two-state solution, which they clearly do not want to. And this is not just because, of course, people say, well, Netanyahu has never been interested in a two-state solution, which of course is true. He's never been interested in it. But I think, especially after October 7, it was already the case before, I think, but now it's even to a different level. There's a widespread belief in the Israeli public that, as they say, as the memes say, we have no partner, and they really believe that, and they really believe that this is impossible. So, there's an argument. So I have a friend who has this argument. I think is wrong, but his argument is not crazy. His argument goes something like this, and he's in favor of the occupation of Gaza. So it's different from the Israeli government, who seems not to want this outcome, even though it's doing something that will inevitably bring it about, in my opinion, or will bring about like a humiliation or a complete, they will have done this whole thing for nothing, basically. His argument is that, look, the daily oppression, such as what's going on in the West Bank, it doesn't make the headlines internationally. It's costly. I think he underestimates how costly it is. I mean, even just in terms of the economic cost of the occupation. Also, I think, as I argued on my blog, I think that if they do this in Gaza, it will be even more costly because in the West Bank they've had the help they could have. They were able to count on the Palestinian Authority to delegate a lot of the administration and policing, etc., that would otherwise add to their cost. In Gaza, they won't be able to count on anyone, I think. So this is costly, etc. But at least it doesn't make the headline. If you're convinced, I think this is the assumption that's wrong here. Otherwise, I think his argument is actually pretty good. If you're absolutely convinced and you're justified in believing that there is just no way you can get to a two-state solution because the Palestinians are just never going to be interested, no matter what inducements you use to get them to agree to it, then there's a certain logic. His argument applies. His argument is that, well, the daily oppression has been going on, for a long time in the West Bank. It doesn't make the headline. Whereas in Gaza, if you leave Hamas around, you have to regularly do those like large-scale military operations that do make the headline because thousands of people are killed. Even when it wasn't as massive and like as much of a carnage as it is right now. Like Cass led in I think that was the 2008 one, Protective Edge in 2014. There was still like there was like a lot of casualties, and this would make the headline. You would have international call for human rights investigation, etc. Human rights organization would make reports, scathing report of. So his argument is that, look, this brings a lot of bad attention to Israel. If you're convinced that there is no peace deal possible, then his argument is we may as well reoccupy it and do what we do in the West Bank over there. Because although this is bad, because you're oppressing people all the time, it's bad for the Palestinians, but it's better for the Israelis who don't get all that negative attention. And that's his argument, and I think it's a sensible argument. I'm not saying I think it's an immoral position, but I'm saying from a purely cynical point of view, it makes a lot of sense, provided that you agree with the assumption that there is just no way they can ever get to they can ever make a peace deal with the Palestinians. That's what I disagree with. Not because I think that it would be easy, or not even because I'm certain that it could be done, but because I think the probability is high enough that it could be done that it's worth it. Because I think maybe we can talk about this later, but if you're Israel, in my opinion, you have to think about your long-term strategic position. And I think right now, I think they're kind of like their mental state is somewhere between the righteous anger that Americans felt after 9/11 and the hubris that Israelis felt after the Six-Day War. And I think this is a very bad situation. They've never been, they're right, they've never been in a better strategic position in their history right now. I think this is correct. Some of them like say that to say that people like me don't understand, but actually I do understand that. But I think that there's every reason to believe that this will not last, and that their strategic position will deteriorate, and that they will, their basic problem has not changed. And their basic problem is that they're surrounded by hundreds of millions of people who regard their state as fundamentally illegitimate. And this is their basic problem. And this has not changed. And what they're doing right now is not going to help that. In fact, I think it's going to make it more complicated. Not so much because it will increase the hostility toward them, certainly not among the Palestinians, who basically hate them already as much as they possibly can, pretty much. So, if they hate them a little more, it won't make much of a difference. But in the Arab world, it's there's probably still some room for the hostility toward Israel to increase. I'm talking about the population here, not, which I think is an important distinction, not the states, the government. But the thing is that it's not, my argument is not even so much that it will increase hostility toward Israel. My argument is that it won't reduce it. And therefore this goes nowhere toward solving the basic Israeli strategic problem, which is the one I just outlined. And in fact, I think it will make it harder to solve, not so much again because it will increase hostility toward Israel, but because uh, once you create, you occupy, it's always hard to undo an occupation, even if there is no settlement, which honestly cannot be ruled out either. That they will eventually build settlements over there. I don't think that's the most likely option, but I don't think it can be ruled out at all. And I don't think the present government of Israel can rule it out. Even putting aside the fact that there are several people in that government who actually would like to do this, but I think most of them would not. But um, so they have to think about this. They have to think about the fact, at least in my opinion, that they will have to make peace, and they will have to give the Palestinians a state, because that's the only way to solve what I call the Palestinian question, which is Palestinian irredentism. And I think that that's their only hope of reducing that hostility toward them in the Arab world. I'm not saying for sure it would work. I totally understand that it would be very difficult, but I think that's the only way they have a chance of becoming a normal state that's more or less accepted in the region, because otherwise, they will stay in that situation where essentially this is not a viable project in the very long term, because they need, in the last resort, they will, right now, as long as they stay in this situation, surrounded by hundreds of millions of people who regard their state as illegitimate, in the last resort, they will always need an external guarantee, namely the Western guarantee, in particular the American guarantee, but they cannot just count on always having this guarantee. I think there are two factors that make this assumption dubious, and certainly not one you should just assume will always hold. One of them is that the Holocaust is becoming like a more distant memory, historical event, and I think Israel historically, since its founding, has benefited immensely in the West from the fact that the memory of the Holocaust was still vivid, and it's been such a foundational event um, in the West. And so this gave Israel a capital of sympathy that I think was not negligible, and that even today remains non-negligible. A lot of people are afraid, who would otherwise criticize Israel, are afraid to do so because they don't want to be accused of anti-Semitism. And of course, this fear is made like much more potent by the memory of the Holocaust. But I think that as it becomes more distant, as you know, I was talking about this on Twitter the other day. So if you look at my generation, I think I'm probably the last generation where I've actually talked to people who lived through this period, the World War II period. And I remember stories, I remember my grandmother, so I'm French, in case people have not guessed that from the accent. Uh, and so I remember my grandmother telling me this story of how she has this Jewish friend, and her husband had been summoned by the Germans, and they were told that they were needed to do some work in the woods, and in fact they were shot, in the woods. It's something that happened frequently during the war. And so after that, they asked the French to collect the bodies, and they were put in the local fire station. And but so my grandmother friend was afraid to go there because she was Jewish, and so she was afraid that maybe the Germans would wait, and like pick up the spouses of the victims of their killing. And so she asked my grandmother to go and recognize the body, identify the body for her. So my grandmother went, and she told me about. I remember that told me, when I, about how she saw like her friend's husband like body, like riddled with bullets, etc. And so, um, so it's for people even my generation, and even more so for people older than me. I think it's even more vivid for my parents' generation. It's kind of a close, it's not like any historical event. We still have it. We have some special connection to it, even when you're not Jewish. And so, but this is about to be over, right? Like, I mean, I think if you look at people who are like in 20 today, they don't have that. They're too young to have, or except for like a few exception. I think in France, the last survivor of the Holocaust who was doing those class visits died like this year, the year before that, I think. So increasingly, I think that people will look at the Holocaust the way they look at other historical events, distant historical events, like comparison I was making, like the sack of Delhi by Tamerlane's troops. It's very abstract because it's distant, and this changes things. I think it will considerably reduce um, this capital of sympathy that Israel used to have automatically in virtue of the connection with the Holocaust. That's one thing. And I think another thing is the demographic change induced in the West by immigration. If you look at polling, it's really striking. I mean, even anecdotal evidence. I was in DC. I wasn't going to the protest, actually. I was going to have dinner with a friend, but I was in the subway. And it was on the day where there was one of those protests for Palestine, and it was really striking how non-white the protesters were. And if you look at polling, it's the same thing. There is a striking difference between white and non-white on this issue, where white are much more sympathetic to Israel than non-whites. And I think that's because most people are not ideologues. They almost know nothing about the topic, so their heuristic to decide who they side with is like really simple and even simplistic. The white people, they just see people who like kind of look like them, at least. I know the Israeli always like, oh, the Mizrahi, blah blah, but people in the West don't know that stuff. Like the elites, the Israeli elites are disproportionately Ashkenazi, and that's what people see. So they identify the country as white, and they look at Israeli society. It looks like a Western society, at least from a distance. And so they like irreflexively side with Israel because of that. Whereas if non-whites, I think for similarly superficial reasons, they just see a bunch of white people killing non-white people, and this makes them just as irreflexively side with Palestine. I don't think, again, people know almost nothing about this, even in the protests, where probably people who know more about this than the average person. There was this poll recently about how people like who were singing like "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" could not even name the river and the sea. Half of them. But this is not even in the least surprising to me. I mean, if there is like a ton of research about how that show that voters are extremely low information. I mean, people like us are like really weird people. We're really weirdos. Because when you read books and you get interested in politics and you're even like a little bit informed, it makes you a very weak person. Normal people are not like that because normal people are interested in other shit. They don't care about that stuff. Um, and so they use those. I think my interpretation is that they use those really simple or simplistic heuristics. And so as there is demographic change, as Western countries become less white because of immigration, I think this will be bad for Israel too. So they cannot count, as I said before, right now they depend in a way on ultimately the Western security guarantee, but they cannot count on this being always there. And so I think that's why, even if it's far from a 100% chance of success, they have to try and make peace because that's their only chance of solving in the long term this big strategic problems. So that's kind of my argument in a nutshell. And one last thing I want to say about this is that people have this idea that actually Israel doesn't really need this Western guarantee because they have nuclear weapons. And I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what nuclear deterrence can and cannot do. If you look at 73, the October War, both Sadat and Assad were perfectly aware that Israel had nukes, but they still attacked because they were also perfectly aware that Israel could not use those nukes unless it was really in a situation of desperate situation where that's literally the only way to prevent literal annihilation. And of course, they had no intention of literally annihilating Israel, despite what the propaganda always said. They were much more realistic than that and had much more limited goals. So the problem is that, and I think that's another thing where like people, I think the memes about the 6 Day War have done a lot of damage in that respect. People have this idea that Israel has nothing to fear, even in the long run, from the Arab states because Israel punches so much above its weight, and it's true it punches above its weight. But I think people who say that don't realize how much trouble Israel would be in if it couldn't quickly take out the Arab states' armies at the beginning of the war. Because if this happens, the moment this happens, they are basically screwed. Because if it becomes a war of attrition, there is simply no way Israel can win. At the end of the day, Jews are not, that's another thing. People talk about Jews because of stuff like the 6 Day War as if they were like supernatural creatures with magical powers. But, they're human beings. And if you have 10 million people facing like dozens or even more than 100 million, depending on which Arab states we're talking about or would be involved in this kind of hypothetical war, they just like once they're unable to take out quickly the Arab states at the beginning of the war, they're screwed because they cannot stay. They have to face the Arab states. They have to mobilize a much larger share of the population. This devastates their economy. This has been a problem throughout the threat throughout the existence, the history of Israel. In 49, they had to make those armistice agreements, even though they were unsatisfied with the outcome of the first Arab-Israeli war, because they just couldn't maintain this level of mobilization for that long. It was destroying their economy, and this is always true. So all that to say that if they ever get in that situation, they would have to sue for peace and accept the terms, make like really difficult compromise. It would be very different from the previous wars. They would have to accept terms that would be largely dictated by the Arabs, nuclear weapons or not nuclear weapons. They wouldn't be able to produce enough weapons, etc. So it's just the nuclear weapons do not solve this fundamental problem. And the thing is that as long as you have hundreds of millions of people, as long as you don't change to some extent, at least enough, Arab public opinion toward Israel, this will always be a threat. And it doesn't matter if you can sign, peace agreements. They have a peace agreement with Egypt, but everyone understands that this peace agreement is at the mercy of a coup or revolution. Again, not saying it's very likely, but history is long, and it's just crazy to exclude that this could happen at some point as long as they don't change this. That was long, but that's kind of like a grand tour of how I see the situation strategically and why I think that they have to try and make peace. And right now they're just not even trying, and by their own admission, they're not trying because they really believe that they have no partner, they say, which I think is based on like mostly propaganda about the history of the negotiations. And so they've ended up convincing themselves of their own propaganda. And now they're like in this really bad situation where because of that, they don't even want to try anymore because they think they have nothing to gain and only something to lose in trying. But then it puts them in the situation where like their long-term strategic prospects are getting really screwed by this because again, like right now they're in the best strategic position they've ever been, but for the reasons I just mentioned, there's every reason to think that this will not last.
Yeah, so you kind of mentioned that like the Israelis are currently in this situation where they, invaded Gaza ostensibly with the hope of, destroying Hamas or at least, wiping, taking Hamas out of its position of power over Gaza. And I guess they hoped that they could just invade, do a bunch of damage, and then basically have Egypt occupy Gaza. And it seems like Egypt isn't going to do that because, of course they weren't going to do that. And the Palestinian Authority is not going to do that. And so, Israel kind of has like two options at this point, going forward. They can just, cut their losses and leave. Um, and say like, oh well, at least we restored our deterrence capacity in some respect, or destroyed terrorist infrastructure or something. um or they can try and actually achieve their original goal by just reoccupying the Gaza Strip indefinitely. And you mentioned that there's kind of an argument for the latter option, which is that like the daily kind of oppression of people in the West Bank is not good, at least for Palestinians in the West Bank, but it's not as bad in terms of basically like optical considerations for Israel as kind of the routine massacres that we see Israel carrying out in Gaza, purportedly as a response to the rocket fire that occasionally gets lobbed over from Hamas and other terrorist organizations. Um, and it's an interesting point. But also I think, there's on some level it's like how realistic is it that Israel is able to turn Gaza into another West Bank, just given the fact that, Israel kind of, there's been a ruling power in the West Bank since the Oslo Accords that's basically, more or less Israeli subcontractors, very much dedicated to helping Israel carry out the occupation. And that that was kind of a product of the Oslo peace process. Whereas in Gaza, unlike in the West Bank, in Gaza, it seems like they would have to impose, if they were to impose their own subcontractors or their own rule, it would have to be very much more like kind of hands-on, forcing something on the Gazan population than what's happened in the West Bank over the past, several decades. Um, and so, what do you think the kind of post, if Israel chooses to kind of indefinitely occupy Gaza, what do you think that situation looks like? And do you think that actually improves Israeli security relative to just kind of maybe returning to the pre-October 7th status quo and just kind of leaving the region?
Um, I mean, I guess it depends on exactly what you mean. Like, I agree that in a way, other things being equal, I mean, other things are not equal because Gaza is smaller, considerably smaller than the West Bank. So that's one thing that will make it easier, other things being equal. But other things are also not equal in the opposite direction because, as you were noting, and as I noted at the beginning, they won't be able to count, at least at the beginning, on a subcontractor like the PA in the West Bank, um, and even before that in Gaza. Uh, so this will increase because, as I was saying in my piece, immediately after October 7, it may actually increase the cost of occupation. I mean, it will definitely increase the cost of occupation in the West Bank too, because even if the PA survives this, which is hardly obvious, and so they can still count on that subcontractor, at least in the West Bank, there's definitely like renewed tensions. And so they need to increase the number of troops, etc. But like hopefully for them this is temporary. Um, but nevertheless, at least for a certain period, this will increase. And of course, if the PA doesn't survive this, and if what's left of the Oslo framework completely collapses, then it will increase the cost of occupation, not just in Gaza, where it would have to reoccupy, but even in the West Bank. So in a way, it's even worse than what you're saying, potentially. Now, certainly, yeah, it would be difficult at the beginning, uh, but I think I wouldn't bet that. In fact, I would say that probably eventually they'd be able to co-opt some Palestinians who'd be willing to run Gaza for them. It would still be more hands-on than what they had with Oslo, still in the West Bank. But they can. I have no doubt that given enough time, they can reduce the cost of occupation by relying more and more on co-opting Palestinians to rely more and more on local people. Even if those local people, I have no doubt, also will be regularly murdered, etc. You can find people who will take that chance, if you give them the right inducement. So in time, I think they can. Yeah, it will be more costly, but in time, I think they can reduce this. Like it won't forever be as costly as it initially will, but for sure at the beginning and probably for several years, this will be a big problem, and even later. But then it's hard to say exactly, how this would turn out. I mean, like I said, I'm pretty sure that eventually they'd be able to co-opt some people. I mean, sure, at first it'll be difficult, but because the memory of the carnage will be fresh. But uh, if they manage to like really, really destroy uh, Hamas as an organized structured military force, which I think is quite possible they will. I'm not saying it's obvious because it will depend mostly on whether they're able to continue their operation for long enough and withstand international pressure to do so. But I have to say that so far, like I knew there was a double standard by the West, in particular the US, when it came to Israeli actions. But I have to say that it's been even worse than I thought. So I really wouldn't rule out that they will be able to do this. In fact, if I had to bet right now, I would bet on their being able to do this. And so my bet is still that they will have to reoccupy Gaza because like those other plans are not going to pan out. Similarly, there were also reports about plans to low-key ethnically cleanse Gaza, but this won't work either. Because there is a Western double standard, but it's not that blatant. I mean, even I was pretty black pilled on the Western double standard. I'm not that black pilled. So yeah, in the long run, yeah, I mean, for sure, for several years it will be very costly, and even later it will be costly. But I think this cost will decrease after a while if they manage to really finish off Hamas. I don't think they will finish off Hamas. I don't think this is realistic. I don't think they can destroy Hamas as a political organization. I seriously doubt they can even finish Hamas as like prevent Hamas from, or at least people who claim to be members of Hamas, in the same way that, various terrorists claim to be part of the Islamic State all over the world while committing attacks, for several years, to commit terrorist attacks in Gaza and elsewhere. I don't think this is realistic, but certainly I think completely destroying Hamas as like an organized military structure, that's realistic. But um, and yeah, it will be very costly. I mean, right now what they're doing is very costly. Like that's another thing, that this war is extremely costly. They're mobilizing, a lot of people for a very long time. Uh, it's this is very costly economically, diplomatically. Like they're taking a huge reputational hit right now because of what they're doing. Uh, but people will forget that. Uh, Again, the only people who won't forget that are the Palestinians, and even them in time will not forget it, but at least it will become less present on our mind. Um, but outside of them, the only people who will not forget it are very weird people, read books about this stuff and who are really interested in it for whatever reason. But whatever the precise reason, in very general terms, the reason is that they're weirdos, and normal people will not remember. So this will eventually go away. The cost of the occupation in terms of because this is costly. You have to have men in sufficient numbers um, all the time. You have to pay civilian administrators, etc. This is a lot of money. This will be a lot, but this even that I think will probably decrease eventually, but it will still be more than I think what it would have cost them to just beef up security at the border and kind of like accept that uh that was the best thing they could do even after October 7, and then start relaunch the peace process. But I say that and people are like, of course, so you're some lunatic because this was never going to happen. And I know it wasn't. I knew after October 7 I wrote, of course it's not going to happen, of course they're going to invade and try and destroy Hamas. um I knew that. I'm not crazy, but I'm just saying, I still think that this is the best thing they could have done. And honestly, I've yet to see an argument that I was wrong about this. Uh, People say, oh, the beef up security at the border, like, you can never be perfect. This is what October 7 showed. Actually, it can never be perfect. It will be breached again, and it will be another October 7. I'm sorry, but I'm no military expert, admittedly, but I still have basic common sense. I want someone to explain to me if you put like say 6,000 troops. Again, it's like 75 kilometers long, the border of Gaza. We're not, as I was saying in an article, we're not talking about the Great Chinese Wall here. If you put 6,000 troops, say, at the border, um, like permanently, I don't see how another October 7 can ever happen. Even if there is the same intelligence failing, which that is also very unlikely, especially after what happened. I doubt it would have happened again. And now there are like reports coming out saying that actually they had stuff. But okay, I mean, this intelligence failure, it can happen, and there will be fuck ups. In the long run there would be another fuck up. I have no doubt. But if you physically have thousands of troops at the border, it does. There is no fuck up that will prevent those people from stopping another October 7. There will still be losses, etc. But something like October 7 would never happen again. And I very much doubt that this would have been more costly than what they're going to have to do now that they chose to invade. And the only arguments I've had is someone was saying, well, I mean, sure, it would stop on October 7. At least they would admit that, which was nice. But it wouldn't. They have a lot of people in Gaza. Given time, Hamas could have an even larger army. And so, what if they did on October 7 when instead of 3,000 militants, they had 30,000? And I mean, do you seriously, again, I know there was like a huge intelligence file, but do people really think that you can pull off? Again, I'm no military expert, but 30,000 people, are like preparing to invade your country. You're going to notice that, like it's precisely because 3,000 is still under the threshold where, you won't have like literally see with your own eyes large concentration of people. Like you can't just like have people like, you know, prepare an operation 30,000 people and nobody was going to notice it. Even that, clearly now we see that they should have noticed it. Like there are literally videos of where you see people like training to take over the wall and stuff, and like people are like, oh, that's aspirational. I mean, okay, I can see how something like this could happen, like an operation of that size, but if for 30,000 people, it's just like no. I mean, this would not happen. So but I understand this had no chance of happening but the reason is not because it's rational. I think the reason is because people wanted retribution after what happened. They wanted Hamas to pay, and honestly, most of them wanted the Palestinians to pay, not just Hamas. And I think that explains a lot of what's happening right now. Where it's not that I think it's not true that they're literally bombing indiscriminately. Like, I don't think that's true. If they did, it would be even more murderers. But I think what's happening is just that they don't care, like they will seize any pretext to bomb, and they just won't give a shit if, even that is probably an exaggeration, but I think it's probably close to the truth. If, like, yeah, sure, I mean, we're probably going to kill like a lot of civilians, but whatever, we don't care in a way that they would care before. Even that, not that I think that the IDF was some kind of like paragon of virtue before, like the most moral army of the world, blah blah blah. But uh, but still, like they've clearly like crossed the threshold here, and yeah, I think that's another thing. I mean, you talk to people over there, you read or listen to what they're saying, and I don't understand because people have, like in the essay where I talk about, I argue that, for instance, you don't need to trust the figures of the Hamas controlled, Ministry of Health to see that this is like an unprecedented carnage, because you have proxy data that you can use that will help you to reach that conclusion that in no way rely on Hamas. So this is just like sophistry. But and I was saying in that same article, like, look, it's very weird to me because the criticism I get when I say these sort of things, that people, oh yeah, you're a Jew hater, and like you have some kind of fixation about the IDF and blah blah blah. That's why you say this, and why do you assume that the IDF is like uniquely evil, and that the Israeli are uniquely evil. But I think it's the opposite. It's not me who assume that they're uniquely evil. I think it's the people saying that who assume that they're uniquely virtuous. I mean, again, you have to think about the kind of environments those people are operating in after October 7th. Like, there's clearly a lot of like war fever and bloodlust in the air. You just have to listen to what people are saying over there. Listen to the kind of language they're using. And, you talk, I have friends in Israel, I talk to them. I've seen, it's striking. I mean, they're not, they're intelligent and fundamentally decent people. They're not like crazies, but they will say things that are really kind of shocking, sometimes. Like, and so you see all that, and again, this is something that's understandable after what happened in October 7th. It's not like you to assume that those people would carry out a military operation of that scale and like wake up every morning thinking, what am I going to do today to spare the maximum number of Palestinian civilians? It's just like, this is lunacy, like, of course they're not going to do this in that environment. So that's what I mean when I say that it's the opposite. It's those people who accuse me of assuming that the IDF is somehow uniquely evil, and Israelis in general are uniquely evil, who have to assume that they're uniquely virtuous, because literally this is the only way you're going to have the kind of military operation that they think the IDF is carrying out right now, even though it's only carrying out in their imagination. Um, because otherwise, they're going to do what normal human beings do when they're really, really extremely pissed off, filled with anger and bloodlust, and that's it's just the natural thing. Like, again, the Jews are not like supernatural creatures. They're just no human beings. So, and again, it's not as if there was no precedent. It's not as if Israel was not created yesterday. I mean, it's a young country, but it has like a 75 years long history, and we know that they've carried out like several massacres, and like, this is not a new thing. And I mean, again, don't get me wrong, the Arabs carried out plenty of massacres against them too. I'm not trying to count points here, um, but like, we don't have to conjecture. Again, this is not surprising. Like, human beings are like this. They do crazy shit, and various kind of crimes, when they're in that state. And right now, again, you just have to open your eyes. This is something, I have to say that even though it drives me nuts, like, there's something fascinating about this phenomenon where I see people again are like really smart. I'm talking about very smart people, and also very decent people. And the way in which they manage to be willfully blind about this, not see what's right in front of their eyes, that again is not even surprising when you consider this context. It's just extraordinary. Like, I find it interesting, putting aside all my interest in the conflict itself. I find it kind of like fascinating about human psychology, the way in which people can block, contrary evidence, or interpret it in a way that will like not challenge their uh, prior beliefs when they're like they have the right kind, or in that case the wrong kind, if you ask me, of emotional connections to the topic. Is this is kind of like fascinating and really striking. And I see, but again, even though it drives me crazy because you yeah, I just don't. Again, intelligent people keep reading this talking point about the Hamas control, like Ministry of Health. I mean, come on, just like again, you have several proxies that you can use, even if you make very conservative assumptions. You can see, in my article on this, I used the number of journalists killed and compare it with previous operation to like a simple extrapolation, or I also used the number of UNRWA uh, uh, staff that's been killed. And I say, yeah, sure. I mean, I know you all believe that UNRWA are all like Hamas terrorists, even though your arguments for this are really embarrassing. You treat that in a footnote, but even if you make really conservative assumption, then because they're all terrorists, they're like much more exposed to the risk of being killed by bombs than the rest of the population. You still end up with like crazy number of casualties. So you don't have to rely on Hamas. You can make like extremely conservative assumptions, and you still end up with the result that this is like a huge carnage. But people will still, again, like otherwise very intelligent people will still repeat those talking points like a bunch of like mindless zealot. And I find that really striking. But again, this is not specific to this case or Israel, but it's more of a general observation. I mean, it's just a particular instance of a more general phenomenon you know, that maybe I haven't had the occasion to observe, so obviously is during this conflict, but it's an interesting fact, although kind of depressing too. But
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, just to like I guess like buttress some of your points there. I mean, it was funny. I remember literally I think so you wrote an article on the carnage in Gaza, called Gaza Heroes and Terrorists. And I think literally like a day after you published that article, Haaretz, I think that's how you pronounce it, Haaretz, released an article titled "The Israeli Army Has Dropped the Restraint in Gaza and the Data Shows Unprecedented Killing." Um, so it seems like this is something that even like mainstream Israeli media is reporting on, that civilian casualties are very high. Um, and there is some precedent for this as well. We saw kind of similar things with Cast Lead, with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch saying that and I think this was suggested by another article that you cited in your article from 972 magazine, which is that like basically Israel is pursuing some sort of policy of basically inflicting maximum carnage with the aim of, maybe creating some domestic pressure on Hamas or something like this. And so, the inflicting suffering on Gazan civilians seems to be not entirely even thought of as a con or as collateral damage, but maybe to some degree as part of the strategy. Um, but and then like with respect to the point you made about there were less costly options that Israel could have taken. Um, Again, I think after you published your article, initially making this point, in Israel's 9/11 moment, there was of course subsequent New York Times reporting that, just kind of demonstrating the extent to which this was something that was entirely kind of foreseeable. Israel had the plans for this specific attack like over a year out, and observed Hamas preparing and training for this attack. And the article kind of suggests that in large part the reason they didn't do anything to stop it is because um, the sentiment was just, well, look, we don't really think they'll ever do something like this. We don't even think they have the capability to ever do something like this, so we're not going to take it seriously. Um, but like presumably that factor is kind of gone now after they saw it
Yeah,
happen. And so it's like, the risk of that same mistake happening after they have, been taught such a stark lesson, um, seems quite low. Which is, important when people talk about like, oh, well, Israel needs to destroy Hamas or else there will be another October 7th or
yeah,
something like that. Um, but I wanted to talk a little bit about before, or of course, if I say anything else that you want to comment on additionally in any of my remarks, you can feel free to comment on that as well.
sure.
But I also wanted to get to the issue of, we've talked a lot about what Israel has done and kind of what are the costs of that strategy wherever they choose to go. If they choose to just leave after causing all this devastation, it'll basically all have been for nothing. If they choose to reoccupy Gaza, obviously that will be very costly. And as you mentioned, over the long term, it's kind of unsustainable as kind of sympathy is going to inevitably wane for the Israeli cause. Um, and you suggest that what they should have done instead is to pursue a negotiated settlement with Hamas and kind of try and relaunch the peace process. And of course, a lot of people are going to object to that, mostly on the basis that, they're going to say Hamas is simply too radical and too extreme of an organization to ever be negotiated with, and therefore there can be no hope of successfully negotiating any diplomatic settlement until Hamas has been removed from its position of control in Gaza. People will cite Hamas's 1988 charter and their history of violent terror attacks against Israel as proof of this. So I guess like what do you make of that? Like, what do you make of the prospects for uh, successful diplomatic negotiations with an entity like Hamas?
So one thing I should say, and this is related to what I'm going to say next, is that when I say that I think Israel should pursue a negotiated settlement with Hamas, first of all, I'm not suggesting that Hamas be the only Palestinian organization they negotiate with. I'm just saying, realistically, it will have to include Hamas. And I have to say, this will be true even after this, even if, as I expect, they end up reoccupying Gaza, because I don't believe that Hamas, as a political organization, will disappear. And they will still be a major player in Israel. If they ever want to pursue a negotiated solution, we'll have to include them. Um, and so I'm not saying that there should be the only organization doing that. And so then, there's a question, of course, of whether it's realistic at all to want to negotiate a two-state solution with Hamas, given that facially, or so people claim, they're not interested in, and of course, there's evidence for this. They're not interested in a two-state solution. But the problem I have with this is that people always, they selectively choose the evidence. And, there is actually a lot of evidence that Hamas, or at least because that's the other thing, Hamas is not monolithic. No organization is. And and so you have different people in Hamas, and some of them, there is evidence that they are, in fact, prepared to accept some kind of two-state solution, whereas others are more radical and are not. And so my point is that Israel's action influences, of course, they're not the only factor. It's not that simple, but they're a major factor in which faction uh, is, has more influence. And so, and what bothers me with this stuff that, of course, a two-state solution, Hamas pursuing a two-state solution with Hamas is unrealistic, is that, again, people just like selectively choose the evidence. So they will cite the charter, but there's like, if you look back on the history, it's very different. There were several moments where Hamas has shown some inclination toward accepting a two-state solution. Even just recently, there was a statement by a political leader of Hamas suggesting that, just like a few days ago. But people will say, "Oh, that's because they're defeating them, etc." Maybe it is for this guy, but this happened in the past. And um, if you look at 2006, 2006, 2007, there was this moment where uh, Hamas, Fatah, and a bunch of other uh, Palestinian organizations, sign an agreement. It's like the prisoners' document, I think it was called, um, which was toward creating a unity government that would then negotiate with Israel uh, for a two-state solution. And so they signed this document, and the final version of this document amounts to an implicit recognition of the state of Israel. And it was signed by Hamas. And this was widely recognized at the time as an implicit recognition of Israel. Commentators noted that, etc. But Israel insisted that this wasn't enough. And so they rejected the unity government and agreed only to negotiate with Hamas because they wanted an explicit acknowledgement, recognition of Israel by Hamas at the outset. And this, I think, basically doomed, even if Olmert had not had his legal issues and Livni had not lost the election, and this would have doomed the process, because by this point, I believe that Fatah alone, they would be part of any serious negotiation, although in the future, who knows what's going to happen. But at the time, you certainly needed Fatah. It was still important enough that you couldn't do a deal without them. I think right now it's still true. I don't know whether it will still be true in 10 years, but the truth is that Fatah alone did not have the legitimacy to endorse a final peace agreement with Israel. So realistically, you needed Hamas there, and it was even better if you had the others too. But Israel sunk that by demanding an explicit recognition at the outset of the process. And I think that's just unreasonable. And that it was a mistake. It was a political mistake. It was a moral mistake. And my argument is this: if you really think about what cards the Palestinians have in their hands, they only have really two cards. One of them is the end of the violence, something they can give Israel. One of them is the end of the violence, and the other is the recognition of Israel. And Fatah did that, in 88, and look where it got them. They got Oslo, which didn't even include a promise that there would be a Palestinian state. And then we know where this ended up. So they only have those two things, and I don't think it's reasonable for Israel to demand at the outset, at the beginning of the process, that they give up this card, one of their only two cards at the beginning. So I think it wasn't reasonable to ask. I definitely think, of course, it's reasonable for them to demand that by the end of the process, in a final agreement, there is some explicit recognition of Israel. I don't think, the Hamas concept of Hudna, which is a truce, would cut it. They would need, or, they could call it whatever they want, but it would have to be, well, actually, they could not call it whatever they want because this matters. But they would have to eventually get behind some explicit recognition of it and non-ambiguous recognition of Israel. So this is entirely reasonable, in my opinion, for Israel to demand that by the end of the process they do this. But to demand that they do this at the outset, when that they give up one of the only two cards they have, I don't think it's reasonable, and I don't think it was right, neither politically nor morally. And especially since the last people who have done this, it's kind of didn't work out for them or for the Palestinians. So that made it extra unreasonable for them to demand this from Hamas, in my opinion. And I think this is something people just don't think about, because it seems so natural to them that they should recognize at the outset. But look, if you look at all those issues, if you look in 2000, the right of return, for instance, before they want, for instance, before the Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, he wanted they were prepared to accept, and as later events showed, they were prepared to accept that it would not be implemented in practice. That is, unless at least not a very large number of Palestinians would actually return to Israel proper. That in fact most of them would return to the Palestinian state that would be created, and they would receive financial compensation. So it would be kind of this fake right of return, but they still wanted the right to be acknowledged, because this would give them a card. And again, they have almost no card. You have to understand this, and put yourself in their shoes. And this is a similar issue. And so people, this is just an example. There are other examples. It's just an example of how people selectively choose the evidence that suggests that Hamas could never, ever get behind a two-state solution, and they set aside the evidence. And again, there is a lot of it. I'm not saying that Hamas would necessarily, that it would never necessarily work. When I'm saying there is a significant amount of evidence that they could get behind a two-state solution eventually, but people selectively choose the evidence and like omit this completely. And look, if you were to do the same thing with Fatah, if you look at the history of the Palestinian resistance movement, um, Fatah took a long time to recognize Israel. Honestly, I think from their point of view, it turned out to have been a mistake, to do it before they had like a firm guarantee that they would get to state too, because there's this like asymmetry that was. But anyway, I'm just not going to come back to this. But if you look at the history of Fatah, it's very clear that starting from the 70s, they're trying to find a way. They've accepted that Israel is here to stay, and they're trying to find a way. But you have to understand their political constraint. They just can't say it like this. It's difficult politically. So you could have made the exact same argument that you could never ever have some kind of two-state solution with Fatah because their charter also opposes stuff. But obviously that was false. I mean, I say obviously, many people denies this, but I think they're demented. But I mean, we only have so much time. So you could make the same argument. In any case, even if they deny this, they don't make this argument with Fatah. They talk about Hamas as if it were special in that respect. So it doesn't really matter what they say, in other contexts about Fatah. So they could have made that same thing, but clearly that wasn't true of Fatah at the time. So why would it be true of Hamas? I mean, maybe it's true, you can't be sure. But look, I mean, Israel is in a very strong position. There is like a very clear asymmetry, and the the potential benefit of solving this conflict are are so important that even for them, from their point of view, well, it would be worth taking the risk because the risk is really minimal. And I think the Israelis like really exaggerate it. I mean, it's not as if, look, like if Hamas starts like a negotiation process, like in that possible world where this happens, they're not going to do another October 7. I mean, again, we already discussed how in any case, Israel could take steps to prevent that from happening. So what do people think is going to happen? I mean, of course, if they create a Palestinian state without sufficient guarantee, what could happen is that Palestinians would attack Israel from that state, and it would be in a better position to inflict damage on Israel. But in any realistic scenario, Israeli power will be overwhelming compared to that even of a Palestinian state. And moreover, if the Palestinians do that, do attack Israel, despite the fact that they signed a final agreement, then Israel would have like a much stronger diplomatic and moral case to reply with force. So they would be, if they want to do that after this, they would be in a much better position to do it. And that's another thing that people never mention. So I think they vastly exaggerate the risks. I'm not saying there are no risks, but you have to have a realistic appreciation of what they are. And I don't think that most Israelis do. I think, they're a bit hysterical about this even before October 7th. So they have to take, but still I acknowledge it's the risk. You have to take a chance, and you cannot be sure it will work. But and of course, politically it's very complicated. I think actually that's the real difficulty here. I don't think it's the theoretical security risk or all that stuff. Really the difficulty is like domestic politics. That's what makes the thing really complicated. And yes, I think that's the best argument against the idea that it's really difficult to see how realistically what kind of like political path you could take to get you there if you're an Israeli leader. And I agree, this is a powerful argument. I don't think it's an argument for doing what they're doing right now, but I think realistically, this is not going to happen overnight. That's an understatement. But I think it's worth taking a risk, but I admit it would be a risk. And yeah, I wrote another essay, which I called The Zionist Dilemma, which starts with like a kind of counterfactual history of Zionism. And I imagine what would have happened if Zionism had emerged a century earlier. And I argue that it would have been much easier and much better for everyone, including the Palestinians. Paradoxically, the main reason being that the Palestinians would not have become Palestinians. Basically, they would have been expelled. The Zionists would have been able to expel them much more completely from the territory of history Palestine. And of course, this would have been really bad for the people being expelled. But this was before this would have been before nationalism started to spread in the Middle East. So uh, essentially, they would have been expelled to the rest of the region, and then they would have undergone the process of nationalization wherever they happened to be. So if you imagine that they would still have been a Syria and Egypt, Jordan, or whatever in this alternative history, they would have become Syrians, Jordanians. But whereas, by 48, it was over. I mean, the nationalization process was not complete yet among Palestinians, but it was advanced enough that there was no coming back. And so that's how you add like Palestinian irredentism. So uh, I argue it would have been better for everyone, but the fact that it didn't happen, I think, is largely responsible for the main strategic problem of Israel that I was describing before, which is that they end up having to deal with both a large irredentist movement of people who are about as numerous as they are, at least on the territory of historic Palestine. If you include the Palestinians abroad, then they're even more numerous, who have a claim on the same land as them. And when they're not a tiny minority, this is not something that's in the long term. This is not a viable situation. You cannot exterminate them, literally, at least not anymore. Uh, so this is not a viable situation. And also this irredentism, it fuels the hostility toward Israel and the rest of the Arab world. And for the reasons I described above, this is the one those two things are the two really existential threats on Israel. Hamas is not an existential threat to Israel. This is ridiculous talk. People say that, and that's absurd. It's just, I don't know why we have to countenance people saying ridiculous shit like this, but uh, it's really bad. You can say Hamas is really bad. I don't deny this, but don't say stupid shit like, it poses an existential threat to Israel. It obviously doesn't. Um, but more broadly, Palestinian irredentism and Arab hostility, this does, again, that's not to say, I certainly don't mean by this that, like, in the immediate future, Israel faces literal destruction because of this. But in the long run, it threatens the very viability of the state. I don't even think it threatens literal annihilation, even in long term, but it definitely is a threat to the viability of the state. And to become non-viable, it doesn't have to be literally annihilated. Uh, and so, but this situation, the hostility, the large irredentist movement that has a claim on the same land, and the hostility of the hundreds of millions of Arabs they're surrounded by, this was created by the fact that, in a way, the Zionist movement came too late. It arrived, by the time where colonialism was already getting out of fashion, and so by the time the state was created, uh, it was like a really bad time to do this, because people in the region were going to have a really hard time accepting that essentially a bunch of immigrants came, and after 30 years, with the help of the colonial power, were able to establish their political supremacy over this land by expelling most of the indigenous population. And I know what the Zionists say. Oh, but we have this historical connection to the land, and I'm not denying this. I'm not one of those people who believe that the Jews are like really Khazar that converted and blah. We have genetic studies. I agree they have a historical connection. I agree that a lot of their ancestry comes from people who come from that region. But like, who cares? I mean, it's just like it doesn't matter. Like the Arabs who were there, they don't give a shit about this. And nobody would in their stead. It's just like so. I mean, people talk as if the Arabs who got expelled and their descendants should like somehow recognize that after all their land was really the Jews' land, and so they should like graciously accept. That's ridiculous. I mean, it's just like again, that's not to deny. Don't deny the historical connection. I perfectly understand why the many Jews feel some kind of emotional attachment to the land and like and are Zionists. As I say in one of those pieces, if I had been a Jew, honestly, I would probably have been a Zionist. So I understand. I don't feel the same because I'm in fact not Jewish, so I don't feel this like emotional connection to the project. But actually, contrary to what many people understand, because they think I hate the Zionists and the Jews in general, etc., I do understand the emotion they feel toward the project. I do understand it, but they have to understand how the Palestinians feel. And the Palestinians very naturally are not going to care about this stuff, about the historical connection, blah, blah, blah. They don't care. Neither should they. You know, it's a perfectly natural thing. So people need to take that into account. But anyway, so this was the situation because of the fact that, in a way, uh, Zionism kind of missed the train of history. They ended up in this very bad long-term strategic position where they face this very large irredentist movement and they're surrounded by hundreds of millions of people who hate them. And this created, so that's what I'm arguing in that piece. It created uh this plus the history of Judaism persecution and the fact that the early Zionists really had a lot of contempt, to be honest, for the Jews in diaspora, who they saw as meek, you know, and accepting their persecution willingly, going to the slaughter without doing anything. That was the kind of ideas that they had. I think it was unfair to the Jews in the diaspora, but that's the idea they had. And so it informed their practice of policy after they created the state. Those two factors. Uh, and that's understandable, you know. Again, if I had been them, it's likely that I would also have reacted in the same way. What it did is that they, you know, it led them to form like a very aggressive conception of deterrence because they didn't believe that they could ever really, at least, you know, if you read what like people like Ben Gurion were writing in 48, 49, 50, so yeah, not right now. Maybe in one or two generations we can make peace with the Arabs. Right now we can never really make peace with the Arabs, or well, it depends on the period. But so they had this very aggressive. They needed to demonstrate that the Arabs would never be able to destroy them by force. And so they had this very aggressive conception of deterrence, where they would use like overwhelming force and reply with like disproportionate force to like Palestinian infiltrations. Um, During the 50s in particular, where you know, you had like Palestinians who would infiltrate into Israel and like commit murder, and then they would kill two people, and then you know like Israel would make those retaliation raids that would be like massively disproportionate, and that was part of this conception of deterrence, which I think this conception of deterrence, even though that's what I call the Zionist dilemma. The thing is that this conception, this very aggressive conception of deterrence, it's a very natural reaction to their objective conditions that I just described before. The natural reaction to this. And if I had been in their place, it's quite possible that I would have done the same thing. Um, but the problem is that I also think that this is the thing that prevents them from solving their long-term strategic problems, which is this, both the irredentism of the Palestinians and the hostility of the Arab world, because it prevents them from, it makes them extremely risk averse and prevent them from taking the kind of risk I was arguing they need to take. And so as a result, you know, it prevents them ultimately from having a shot of solving this fundamental strategic problem, the actual existential threat uh, that exists for their state, for the viability of the Zionist project. And so that's what I call the Zionist dilemma. You have this psychological disposition that on the one hand is a very natural reaction to their objective situation, but on the other hand, as long as it exists, prevent them from changing those conditions that give rise to this thing. And so, and I think that's what we're seeing still. You know, this extreme risk aversion still dominates their security thinking and is the major explanation, for instance, for why they will not negotiate with Hamas. Of course, they don't think that's the explanation. You know, they will say that it's because it's impossible. We talked about this, but if you look at the evidence, I don't think that's true. Again, I'm not saying it would for sure work. I'm saying what's definitely not true is that it has zero chance of working, or you know, so close to zero that for all practical purposes, it's the same thing as that zero chance. So that's kind of my argument in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think yeah, I mean it's a good point in the sense of like it's kind of hard to see exactly where peace talks with Hamas would get Israel. But, there's some historical precedent for it, and there's been some indication from Hamas. I mean, I think, there was the there was the signing of the prisoners agreement that you mentioned in 2006. I think there were some reports from like Jimmy Carter in 2006 as well that like Hamas leaders had basically told him that they would be willing to agree to like a two-state solution negotiated between Israel and Fatah, provided it were like ratified via referendum by the Palestinian people or, stuff like that. Um, and this kind of extends throughout, like 2008, 2009, there were repeated statements to this effect that Hamas would be willing to accept a two-state solution. Of course, they'd specify like this kind of more extreme version of a two-state solution, like 67 borders,
Yeah,
full
yeah.
right of return, blah, 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 which is probably not going to happen. But I mean, it's telling that they're at least willing to talk about a peace
Yes,
deal.
yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I think that, and so yeah, and I think that, as you point out, a lot of people kind of both overstate the risk and then kind of understate the alternative risk or the risk of not doing it, which is sure, things could end up kind of in a worse position if Hamas, the Palestinians continue to attack Israel from their new state. It could get slightly worse in that now they're in a slightly better position to attack, but still ultimately the risk is still quite low. Meanwhile, if there's no attempt at reaching a peaceful solution, it's almost certain that Israel's situation will continue to deteriorate. They'll continue to lose sympathy and whatnot. Um, yeah, and I think that so yeah, I think that in terms of um in terms of like the I guess I don't want to hold you over for too much longer because I think we're kind of reaching about 2 hours. So yeah, I think we
Yeah.
could yeah, I think that's a fine place to end.
Yeah. I mean, it's a logical place
Mhm.
to end at any
Yeah,
rate,
yeah.
but
But yeah, anyways, thanks for coming on. I enjoyed talking um,
oh yeah, it was.
about
I
this.
think it would be a good podcast. It's kind of like, yeah, I have time to talk and like explain stuff in
Mhm,
some depth, and some people don't like to read, but they will listen to a podcast, and I feel
mhm,
like it was a good kind of like run around of like, uh, yeah, my general position on this stuff,
mhm,
and also more toward focused on the. Although we also touched on the what's happening right now, and like the all the like carnage and everything, but and I do think it's important to talk about it, but uh, ultimately, I think the more general debate is more interesting,
mhm.
and more important because whatever the carnage is happening, and I don't think you know anything's gonna stop it. No, certainly not us.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, the I wanted to like a bit I thought about maybe like talking a bit about the kind of, this more broad like, well, Palestinians will never accept peace, but getting into the entire history of the peace process is kind of a kind of
yeah,
a bit of a
yeah, yeah. I
task,
mean,
but
I will write on this. Maybe we can do another podcast of this.
yeah, yeah.
It's That's the thing, of course, that makes this so difficult is that look, it's the same story. I feel the same about the Russian Western relations, where I think, the story is much more complicated than the standard narrative. I mean, obviously that doesn't mean that the I approve of the
Mhm.
invasion of Ukraine, but just, it's not just you cannot reduce the whole thing to just like, oh, the evil Russians who always like love to invade their neighbors just did it. It's like there was a whole like 30 years long process that was more complicated and that led to this point. And I think it's interesting and important to think about how we got to this point. But the problem is that, the standard narrative, you can defend it in like 30 seconds. You cite a bunch of stuff and like it's superficially very convincing. If you want to argue against it, you have to go back to 30 years of history And like it's the same thing of the story of like the the we have no partner bullshit.
Yeah.
If you want to explain why it's wrong, I mean, I think you literally have to go back to the mandate period, because people don't know, like they don't know the basic history of Zionism, and so because for instance, I think a big issue about the debate about the on the negotiations is that people have fucked up standard about there's this whole debate about whether the offer this or that offer was reasonable or good or generous, but generous based on what standard,
Hmm.
like that's the really important question, and the standard that people use, when they make when the claim that they implicitly use when they make the claim that the offer was generous, say the Camp David offer, the standard they're implicitly using, of course, they never make that explicit. I don't even think themselves, realize that. Is the standard is like it's generous compared to previous offers. I mean, since there basically
Hmm.
wasn't any previous offer, if we're talking about like a Palestinian state, that's not difficult, but that's just a ridiculous standard. I mean, uh, you have to look at the history and what the Palestinians had already given up by that point.
Hmm.
And then you have to look at international law, etc. And I think that will give you a much better standard. But of course, then the conclusion you'll reach will also be very different. So, but okay, you can't do this in 5 minutes, like, and so you're gonna lose this debate, every single time because the other guy will just like cite, Clinton saying it was Arafat's fault, which was really an exercise in like ass covering. Uh, but it sounds very convincing, like people think, oh, Clinton was like, he has no bone in that fight, like, so if he says that, it must be true. But I mean, we have evidence it's not true. And also even like his own appreciation or the American appreciation again is based on this fucked up framework where, what makes the offer generous is that it's better than what Israel offered before. I
Hmm.
mean, it's like, by this kind of standard, if like the Nazis are like decided, okay, we're not going to do the full genocide. Actually, we're going to just like spare one of every two Jew. That would have been a generous offer. Which I mean, I guess by one standard, it would have been a generous offer, but it's still ridiculous to call it. And um, so, but again, yeah, you have to. People don't know, this entire the fact that the Palestinians used to basically live there, and then like in a period of 30 years, like a bunch of immigrants just kicked them out. It
Hmm.
just completely it's never part of the picture, So, but for the Palestinians, of course, it's part of that picture. It's like the major part of the picture, and but you cannot, you cannot really assess this, even the details about. And then then you have all the then you go to the specifics, and you have all the stuff about people saying, oh, they made no counter offer, and then you look at the details of what even they themselves are saying, and And the only way you can get to the conclusion that the Palestinians made no counteroffer is by making some ad hoc assumption that when the Israeli do something, like presenting a map, that's an offer. But when the Palestinians do the exact same thing, that's not a counteroffer for some magical reason. But that's the
Hmm.
same thing. You have to explain this. You have to go into the details and stuff. And it's like it takes forever, and you just cannot do. So yeah, I plan to write about that. I don't have time right now, but
Hmm.
I plan to write about this. And but it's kind of like a again like a fight. I do it because I find that interesting and it forces me to clarify my own thoughts on the issue, and sometimes I think maybe I will convince two or three people if I'm
Yeah.
lucky, uh and maybe I will make like some other people doubt, a few more doubt whether maybe the standard narrative is right, even if they will not buy my arguments. But that's it, that's most people are not going to read like very long stuff, and so it's just. But yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
it's the same thing for everything. It's a special.
Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of I won't get into a whole thing because I know you have to go soon. But yeah, I mean it was interesting the history of the thing about the history of the peace process in terms of like, this idea that like um uh this idea that like, oh well, the Palestinians just don't offer anything, they've never offered anything, and they've ne just always been rejectionist. It's like, it's kind of interesting if you look at like international law, or like the
Yeah.
international
They're the
consensus.
only ones making concessions.
Exactly. They're the only ones who have ever made any concessions in any of these
Yeah.
talks.
Yeah,
You
it's
know,
that's directly related to the point I was making about how people use a fucked up standard to decide it's the same thing, what's generous or who's making concessions.
mhm.
And there are books, like Arafat, like repeatedly made that point. It's like, what are you talking about? You say they made some concession stuff, but what are you talking about? They're making concessions about stuff they have no rights to,
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's just like, and
Yeah.
he's right, he's just right. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, but
Yeah, thanks for coming on. And yeah, uh if you ever, release your article about the peace process, or maybe we can talk
yeah,
about that or have some
very,
follow-up.
very
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Yep. Yeah, thanks.